She looked at me with that practiced smile of hers, the one she used when delivering bad news wrapped in false politeness, and said it like she was commenting on the weather forecast. Actually, Elaine, we've decided to keep Easter more intimate this year. Just immediate family, you know. I nodded calmly, collected my purse from the kitchen counter, and walked to my car without creating any drama or making a scene. What Miranda didn't realize was that by Monday morning, their beautiful three-bedroom colonial would be heading straight toward foreclosure. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Because for 2.5 years, I'd been quietly covering their entire mortgage payment every single month, and she'd just given me the perfect reason to stop. The whole situation started 3 years ago when my son Chris called me with excitement practically bubbling through the phone, like he'd just discovered buried treasure in his backyard. "Mom, we found it," he said, his voice carrying that special kind of hope that comes when young couples finally see their dreams taking shape in brick and mortar. The perfect house in Willowbrook Estates. 3 bedrooms, 2 full baths, updated kitchen, and Mom, it has that wraparound porch you always said made a house feel like a real home. Chris had always been my pride and joy, born when I was 38 after years of thinking motherhood might never happen for me. His father, Harvey Barnett, passed away from a sudden heart attack when Chris was only 14, leaving me to navigate those crucial teenage years alone, while working as a regional sales manager for a medical supply company. Every overtime hour, every weekend conference, every promotion I pursued was driven by one goal: ensuring Chris had every opportunity to build the life he deserved. When he graduated from State University with his business degree and landed a solid position at Henderson and Associates, I felt like every sacrifice had been worth it. That's when he met Miranda Jones. She worked in event planning for an upscale catering company downtown, drove a leased Audi, and had very definite opinions about everything from organic produce to vacation destinations that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The first time Chris brought her home for dinner, Miranda spent 30 minutes rearranging my dining room because the centerpiece didn't flow properly with the seasonal theme she thought I should be going for. She wasn't openly rude about it, just supremely confident that her aesthetic vision was superior to mine. I smiled and helped her move things around, telling myself that young people today had different standards and maybe I could learn something from her sophisticated eye. They'd been dating for 10 months when Chris called about the house, his voice carrying that infectious excitement that made me grin despite myself as he described the granite countertops, the master suite with the walk-in closet, and the finished basement where he planned to set up his home office. "There's just one problem, Mom," he said, and I could hear his voice shift to that worried tone I remembered from his college years. "We're about $12,000 short on the down payment. The sellers won't negotiate on price, and our mortgage broker says we really need 20% down to get the best interest rate and avoid PMI. I didn't hesitate for even a second. "I'll transfer it tomorrow morning," I told him. "Consider it an early housewarming gift." The silence that followed lasted so long I thought our connection had dropped. Then I heard him take one of those shaky breaths that meant he was trying not to get emotional. "Mom, I can't ask you to do that. That's a huge chunk of your retirement savings." But it wasn't really a question, and we both understood that. I'd been living in the same comfortable 2-bedroom condo for 8 years, driving my reliable Honda Civic, clipping coupons and cooking most meals at home. My retirement account was healthy enough to spare $12,000 for my son's happiness, especially when I could see how much this house meant to his future with Miranda. The closing went smoothly, and I'll never forget the photos Chris sent from their first night as homeowners, him and Miranda sitting on moving boxes in their empty living room, holding champagne glasses and grinning like teenagers who'd just won the lottery. The caption read, "Home sweet home, thanks to the most amazing mom in the world." I printed that photo immediately and put it on my refrigerator right next to Chris's college graduation picture. For the first few months, everything felt perfect between us. They invited me for dinner every other Sunday, and Miranda would give me detailed tours of the improvements they were making. New pendant lights over the kitchen island, plans for a herb garden in the backyard, paint samples taped to the living room walls, while she debated between coastal sage and morning mist. I had to admit, she had excellent taste. The house was slowly transforming into something that belonged in one of those home design magazines she was always studying. That's when I made what seemed like a helpful suggestion during one of our regular Sunday dinners. Miranda had been talking about how overwhelming all the new homeowner expenses were: property taxes that were higher than expected, utility bills that fluctuated wildly depending on the season, maintenance costs they hadn't fully budgeted for, and the pressure of keeping up with the mortgage payments on top of everything else. "It's like every month there's some new expense we didn't see coming," she sighed, pushing her pasta around her plate with the kind of frustrated energy I recognized from my own early years of homeownership. I had no idea owning a house would be this financially stressful. I'd been thinking about their situation for weeks actually. After Harvey died, I'd learned the hard way how many financial responsibilities can catch young homeowners off guard when they're already stretching their budget thin. The mortgage payment, in particular, was something that could become overwhelming very quickly if other expenses started piling up. "What's your monthly mortgage payment running?" I asked casually, though I'd actually been curious about this exact figure since they'd bought the place. Chris and Miranda exchanged one of those quick glances that married couples share when they're not entirely comfortable discussing money details. "Honestly, it's tighter than we expected," Chris admitted, running his hand through his hair the way he'd done since childhood when he was worried about something. "Between the principal, interest, taxes, and insurance, we're looking at about $2,400 a month." $2,400 was a significant chunk of their combined income, especially for a young couple still establishing their careers and building their savings. That seemed like a heavy burden for newlyweds who were still figuring out their combined financial picture, I thought to myself.
That does sound challenging.
I said gently.
Are you managing okay with that payment along with
All your other expenses? Miranda's carefully composed expression cracked slightly, revealing genuine worry underneath her usual confidence. "Some months are definitely tighter than others," she admitted, "especially when we have unexpected costs, like when the water heater started acting up last month, or when Chris's car needed those brake repairs." I could see the stress in both their faces as they talked about their monthly obligations. This was the kind of financial pressure that could strain a marriage, especially in those crucial early years when couples were still learning to navigate major decisions together. I'd watched too many young families struggle with house payments that seemed manageable on paper, but became overwhelming when real life intervened.
You know,
I said carefully, "I've been thinking about my own financial situation lately. Since I paid off my condo a few years ago, I have some extra room in my monthly budget. What if I helped you out with the mortgage payment for a while, just until you get more established in your careers and build up some savings?" The suggestion hung in the air between us, like an unexpected gift. Chris's eyes widened with something that looked like relief mixed with embarrassment. "Mom, we couldn't ask you to do something like that. That's way too much." "You're not asking," I pointed out with a smile. "I'm offering. And think of it this way. I'm helping you build equity in an asset, instead of throwing money away on rent. It's an investment in your future together." Miranda's face lit up with the first genuine enthusiasm I'd seen from her in weeks. "Elaine, that would be absolutely incredible," she said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "The financial breathing room would make such a huge difference for us. We could actually start saving for some of the home improvements we've been dreaming about." That's where I made the decision that would change everything, though I didn't realize it at the time. When Chris started to set up the payment arrangement, I suggested something that seemed perfectly logical. "Why don't I just add your mortgage to my automatic bill pay system? It'll be simpler for everyone, you won't have to worry about coordinating transfers each month, and I can handle it directly with the bank." What I was really thinking was that this arrangement would give me peace of mind, knowing their housing was secure even if they hit a rough patch financially. I'd seen too many young couples lose homes because they missed a payment during a difficult month, and I couldn't bear the thought of Chris and Miranda facing that kind of crisis. Chris hesitated initially, his natural independence conflicting with the obvious relief this offer provided. But Miranda quickly warmed to the idea. "Actually, that makes perfect sense," she said. "One less thing for us to track and worry about each month, and this way, we know it's always handled on time." We arranged everything through my bank that following week. I spoke with my mortgage specialist, Patricia Wells, who had been handling my financial services for over a decade. She helped me set up the automatic payment system with Chris and Miranda's mortgage company, listing me as an authorized party who could make payments on their behalf. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. This is very generous of you, Patricia noted as we completed the paperwork. Not many parents are in a position to help their adult children with something this significant. For the first 8 months, the arrangement worked flawlessly. I never mentioned the payments to Chris and Miranda, it just happened automatically on the first of each month, like clockwork. They were free to focus on their careers, their marriage, and gradually making their house into the home they'd always envisioned. I felt good knowing I was contributing to their stability and success as a young couple. The problem started slowly, so gradually that I almost didn't notice the shift at first. It began last summer when Miranda's sister Cecilia moved to town after her divorce. Cecilia was 3 years younger than Miranda, recently single after a messy separation, and had very strong opinions about family boundaries and financial independence. She stayed with Chris and Miranda for almost a month while apartment hunting, and I could sense changes in the family dynamic almost immediately. Suddenly, my regular Sunday dinner invitations became more sporadic. When I did visit, Cecilia would make pointed comments about the importance of young couples establishing their own independence, handling their own responsibilities, and not becoming too dependent on family assistance. I think it's so crucial for couples to manage their own finances completely, she announced one evening while we were cleaning up after dinner, looking directly at me as she spoke. It keeps the relationship dynamics cleaner, less complicated. When parents stay too involved in their adult children's financial lives, it can create these weird dependencies that aren't healthy for anyone. Her message was crystal clear, even though she never addressed me directly. I smiled politely and changed the subject, but I could see Miranda absorbing every word her sister said, nodding thoughtfully as if she'd never considered these perspectives before. Other changes began to emerge as well. My phone calls to Chris were increasingly answered by Miranda, who would explain that he was busy with work projects, at the gym, or handling household tasks. She was never rude about it, just efficiently deflective. "I'll make sure he knows you called," she'd say in that bright professional tone she used. "He'll get back to you when he has a chance." When Chris did call back, the conversations felt different somehow, shorter, more distracted, like he was eager to wrap up and move on to other things. The first real warning sign came in October when I was reviewing my bank statements and noticed something that made my stomach drop. The mortgage payment had bounced. Not because I didn't have sufficient funds. My account had plenty of money. It bounced because Chris and Miranda had apparently tried to make the payment themselves that same day, creating a duplicate transaction that their mortgage company rejected. When I called Chris to ask about it, his explanation was vague and slightly defensive. "Oh, that," he said, and I could hear him shifting uncomfortably even through the phone. "Miranda thought maybe we should try handling it ourselves this month, just to see how it felt to take that responsibility back. But we never discussed changing the arrangement," I pointed out gently. "If you want to start making the payments yourselves, that's wonderful, but we should coordinate the transition so there aren't any mix-ups with the mortgage company." "You're absolutely right, Mom. I'm sorry about that. Miranda just got this idea that we should be more independent, and she didn't think through the logistics." His voice carried a note of frustration, but I wasn't sure if it was directed at Miranda or at me for bringing up the issue. "Can you just handle it like normal next month? We'll talk about any changes before we make them." I agreed, of course, and made sure the November payment went through without any complications. But the incident left me feeling uneasy in a way I couldn't quite articulate. There had been something in Chris's tone, a distance, a formality that reminded me uncomfortably of how he used to sound when he was a teenager trying to manage Miranda's moods and my expectations at the same time. November brought another change that was harder to ignore. My Sunday dinner invitations, which had already become less frequent, were suddenly reduced to every other weekend, then once a month. When I asked Chris about it during one of our brief phone conversations, his explanation felt rehearsed. "Miranda's been really stressed with work lately," he said. "They're planning this huge corporate event for December, and she's been working late most nights. Sunday dinners were becoming another thing on her to-do list instead of something relaxing, so we thought maybe we should scale back for a while." The reasoning sounded logical enough, but something about it didn't sit right with me. In all the months I'd been coming for dinner, Miranda had never seemed stressed by the meal preparation. If anything, she'd always appeared to enjoy showing off her latest decorating projects and discussing their future plans for the house. When I did visit in late November, I could feel the shift in atmosphere immediately. Cecilia was still living with them. Her apartment search had apparently become more complicated than expected, and her presence seemed to dominate every conversation. She had opinions about everything from the dinner menu to the holiday decorations Miranda was putting up, and both Chris and Miranda seemed to defer to her judgment in a way that felt unusual. I keep telling these two they need to start thinking about their long-term financial independence, Cecilia announced while we were having coffee after dinner. It's so important for couples their age to handle all their own responsibility. Creates better habits, better boundaries. The comment was clearly directed at me, even though she was looking at Chris and Miranda when she said it. I felt my cheeks flush with embarrassment, but I managed to keep my expression neutral and steer the conversation towards safer topics. That night, driving home to my condo, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed in my relationship with Chris and Miranda. The warmth and gratitude that had characterized our interactions for the first year were being replaced by something cooler, more distant. It was as if my help had somehow transformed from a generous gift into an awkward burden they were eager to shed. December's mortgage payment went through without incident, but I noticed that Chris hadn't called to check in with me for almost 3 weeks, the longest stretch of silence we'd had since he was in college. When I finally called him directly, Miranda answered and explained that he was at his company's holiday party. We chatted briefly about their Christmas plans, but the conversation felt stilted and formal, lacking the easy familiarity we'd developed over the past few years. Chris mentioned that you've been such a huge help with the house expenses, Miranda said, and something in her tone made me pay closer attention. We've been talking about how to show our appreciation for everything you've done. The comment should have sounded grateful, but instead it carried an undertone that suggested they'd been discussing me and my contributions in ways that weren't entirely positive. I found myself wondering what exactly they'd been saying about the mortgage arrangement, and whether Cecilia's opinions about financial independence had been influencing their perspective on my help. I don't need any special appreciation, I told Miranda honestly. I'm happy to help you and Chris build your future together. That's what family does. Of course, Miranda replied quickly. We just want to make sure we're not taking advantage of your generosity, But even as she said it, I could hear something in her voice that suggested they might already be questioning whether my help was as welcome as it had once seemed. For the first time since I'd started making their mortgage payments, I began to wonder whether my attempt to provide financial security had somehow become a source of tension rather than relief. The holidays were approaching, and I found myself dreading what had always been my favorite time of year, sensing that Christmas dinner might bring conversations I wasn't prepared to have. Christmas dinner confirmed my worst fears. The meal itself was beautiful. Miranda had outdone herself with an elaborate spread that looked like it belonged in a holiday magazine, but the atmosphere felt strained in ways I couldn't ignore. Cecilia dominated most of the conversation, sharing stories about her new job at a marketing firm, and her opinions about everything from the restaurant industry to real estate trends in our area. I keep telling Chris and Miranda they're so lucky to be building equity instead of throwing money away on rent, she said at one point, cutting into her perfectly prepared ham. Though of course true financial independence means handling every aspect of home ownership yourselves. That's when you really know you've made it as adults. The comment hung in the air like an accusation. Chris focused intently on his plate, while Miranda nodded along as if Cecilia had just shared profound wisdom. I felt my appetite disappear, but I managed to smile and ask Cecilia about her apartment search, trying to redirect the conversation away from topics that seemed designed to make me uncomfortable. After dinner, while we were clearing dishes, Miranda pulled me aside in the kitchen. Elaine, can we talk for a minute? She asked, her voice carrying a seriousness that made my stomach tighten with anxiety. Of course, I said, setting down the serving platter I'd been holding. Miranda glanced toward the dining room where Chris and Cecilia were still talking, then looked back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. I wanted to discuss the mortgage situation, she began carefully. Chris and I have been talking, and we think it might be time for us to start handling that payment ourselves. The words I'd been dreading for weeks finally arrived, but they still hit me like a physical blow. Oh, I managed to say, trying to keep my voice steady. If that's what you want, of course we can arrange that. When were you thinking of making the transition? Well, that's the thing, Miranda continued, and now she wouldn't quite meet my eyes. We were hoping maybe January could be the last month you handle it. That would give us time to adjust our budget and set up the automatic payment on our end. January was less than 2 weeks away. After covering their mortgage for over 2 years, nearly $30,000 of my retirement savings, they were giving me less than 2 weeks' notice that my help was no longer wanted. The casual dismissal felt like a slap across the face. That's pretty short notice, I said, working hard to keep any hurt from showing in my voice. Are you sure you're ready to take on that expense so quickly? It's a significant monthly payment. Miranda's expression shifted slightly, and I caught a flash of something that looked almost like annoyance. We've been talking about this for months, actually. Cecilia has been helping us create a better budget, and we think it's important for our marriage to handle all our own responsibilities. Cecilia, of course, the woman who'd been living in their house rent-free for 5 months while dispensing financial advice about independence and responsibility. I felt a surge of anger that I struggled to contain. I understand wanting to be independent, I said carefully. I just want to make sure you're not taking on more than you can handle. Missing mortgage payments can have serious consequences. We'll be fine, Miranda replied, and now there was definitely an edge in her voice. We're both earning good salaries, and without some of the other expenses we've been carrying, the mortgage will be much more manageable. Other expenses? I wondered what she meant by that, but something in her tone discouraged further questions. We finished cleaning up the kitchen in relative silence, and I left shortly afterward, claiming fatigue though it was barely 8 o'clock. The drive home gave me time to process what had just happened. In the span of a 10-minute conversation, Miranda had essentially ended an arrangement that had provided them with nearly $30,000 in assistance over the past 2 years. There had been no acknowledgement of that help, no expression of gratitude, and certainly no discussion of how they planned to manage such a significant change in their budget. But what bothered me most wasn't the financial aspect. It was the cold, businesslike way Miranda had delivered the news, as if she were canceling a subscription service, rather than ending a generous family arrangement. The warmth and appreciation that had characterized our relationship during the early months had completely disappeared, replaced by something that felt almost like resentment. That night, I lay awake thinking about the changes I'd witnessed over the past few months. Chris's increasing distance, Miranda's growing coolness, and Cecilia's obvious influence over both of them. Somehow, my attempt to provide financial security for my son had transformed into a source of tension and discomfort. The next morning, I called Patricia at the bank to discuss canceling the automatic mortgage payment arrangement. That's quite a change, she said, when I explained the situation. Are you sure they're prepared to take on that payment themselves? It's been a significant expense. They say they are, I replied, though privately I had serious doubts about their financial planning. I'll need to cancel the automatic payment starting February 1st. Of course, I'll take care of that right away. Patricia paused. Elaine, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but in my experience, when families make sudden changes to long-term financial arrangements, it sometimes indicates other problems. Are you sure everything is okay? I assured her that everything was fine, but her question stayed with me throughout the day. February 1st seemed very far away, and I found myself wondering whether Chris and Miranda truly understood what they were taking on, or whether they'd simply been influenced by Cecilia's opinions about financial independence without fully considering the practical implications. January passed quietly, with notably less communication from Chris than usual. When I called to check in during the second week of the month, Miranda answered and explained that he was working late on a big project. The conversation was brief and polite, but it felt like talking to an acquaintance rather than my daughter-in-law. Just wanted to remind you that February 1st will be the last automatic mortgage payment, I mentioned before we hung up. Right, yes, Miranda replied briskly. We've got everything set up on our end. Thanks for handling it for so long. Thanks for handling it for so long. 2.5 years of mortgage payments, over $30,000 dismissed with the same casual tone someone might use to thank a neighbor for collecting their mail during vacation. February arrived gray and cold, matching my increasingly somber mood about the family dynamics. I made the final mortgage payment on February 1st as agreed, then called Patricia to confirm the automatic payment cancellation was in effect. All set, she confirmed. The automatic payment has been removed from your account. They'll need to handle March's payment themselves. The finality of it felt strange. For over 2 years, that $2,400 payment had been as routine as my own condo fees and utility bills. Now suddenly, Chris and Miranda were responsible for managing an expense that represented nearly half their monthly take-home income. March came and went without any communication from Chris about how they were adjusting to the new arrangement. I told myself that no news was good news. If they were struggling with the payment, surely Chris would have called to discuss it. But the silence felt unusual given how regularly we'd spoken throughout their first 2 years of homeownership. When I finally called Chris directly in mid-March, the conversation was awkward in ways I couldn't pinpoint. He seemed distracted, giving short answers to my questions about work and the house. When I asked how they were managing the mortgage payment, his response was dismissive. "We're handling it fine, Mom. No problems at all." But something in his voice suggested otherwise. There was a tension, a strain that reminded me of how he'd sounded during his senior year of college when he'd been struggling with his thesis, but didn't want to admit he needed help. April brought an unexpected phone call from Patricia at the bank. "Elaine, I hope you don't mind me reaching out," she began, "but I received an interesting call yesterday from someone at your son's mortgage company." My stomach dropped.
What kind of call?
They were asking about the payment history on the account, specifically whether you had been making payments and when that arrangement ended. Apparently, there have been some issues with their recent payments. I felt a familiar knot of worry forming in my chest. What kind of issues? I can't get specific details since I'm not on their account, but the mortgage company representative seemed concerned about payment consistency since February. Patricia paused diplomatically. "I told them I could only confirm that you had been making payments through January, and that the arrangement had ended at your son's request." After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen staring out at the spring afternoon, torn between concern for Chris and anger at being pulled back into their financial drama, after they'd made it clear my help was no longer wanted. If they were having trouble with the mortgage payments, why hadn't Chris called me directly? The answer came the following week, when my neighbor Mrs. Patterson knocked on my door, holding a folded piece of paper. "Elaine, dear," she said, looking uncomfortable. "I was out for my morning walk when I saw this notice posted on Chris and Miranda's front door. I thought you should know." The paper was a formal notice from their mortgage company, notice of default. The document stated that they were 60 days behind on their mortgage payments and had 30 days to bring the account current or face foreclosure proceedings. 60 days behind meant they hadn't made the March payment, and April's payment was now overdue as well. Nearly $5,000 in missed payments, plus late fees and penalties. In less than 3 months after taking over the mortgage, they were already facing the possibility of losing their house. I stared at the notice, feeling a complex mix of emotions. Part of me wanted to call Chris immediately and offer to help resolve the crisis, but a larger part of me remembered Miranda's cold dismissal in December, her casual thanks for handling it for so long, and Cecilia's pointed comments about financial independence. They had wanted to handle their own responsibilities. Now they were discovering exactly what that meant. I spent the rest of that day walking around my condo, the foreclosure notice lying on my kitchen counter, like evidence of some terrible accident I couldn't prevent. Every instinct I had as a mother screamed at me to call Chris, to offer to catch up the missed payments, to swoop in and solve the problem the way I'd been solving his problems since he was a child. But every time I reached for my phone, I heard Miranda's voice from that Christmas conversation. "We think it's important for our marriage to handle all our own responsibilities." I heard Cecilia's pointed comments about financial independence and true adulthood. I remembered the cold businesslike way Miranda had dismissed over 2 years of assistance with a casual thanks for handling it for so long. They had made their choice. They had rejected my help in favor of independence. Now they were learning what independence actually cost. Still, the maternal worry was eating at me. That evening, I called Mrs. Patterson to ask if she'd noticed any unusual activity at Chris and Miranda's house, extra cars in the driveway, signs of stress, anything that might give me a clue about how they were handling their situation. "Now that you mention it," she said thoughtfully, I did see several cars there last weekend that I didn't recognize, and Miranda seemed quite upset when she was bringing in groceries yesterday. She was on her phone, and from what I could hear, she was arguing with someone about money. The picture was becoming clearer. They were in full crisis mode, probably scrambling to find solutions to a problem that had been building for months. I wondered if they'd told Cecilia about their mortgage troubles, and whether her advice about financial independence seemed less appealing now that they were facing real consequences. 2 days later, my phone rang just before dinner. Chris's name appeared on the screen, and I felt my heart rate accelerate as I answered. "Hi, Mom," he said, and his voice carried a strain I hadn't heard since his father died. "Do you have a few minutes to talk?" "Of course," I said, settling into my favorite chair and preparing myself for whatever was coming. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to know how sorry I am about everything." His voice cracked slightly. "We're in trouble, Mom, real trouble. We haven't been able to make the mortgage payments since you stopped helping us, and now we're facing foreclosure." The admission hung in the air between us. Part of me felt vindicated. I'd known they weren't prepared to handle such a large monthly expense, but mostly I just felt sad for the mess they'd created. "Chris," I said gently, "why didn't you call me when you realized you were having problems? Missing one payment is recoverable. Missing two payments is much more serious." "I was embarrassed," he said quietly, "and Miranda kept saying we could figure it out, that we just needed to adjust our budget, or maybe pick up some extra work. She was so insistent about not asking for help from family." "Where is Miranda now?" I asked, realizing I hadn't heard her voice in the background. Chris was quiet for a long moment. "She's staying at Cecilia's apartment. We've been fighting about this for weeks, and she finally said she couldn't handle the stress anymore. She thinks we should just let the house go into foreclosure and start over with a rental." The situation was even worse than I'd imagined. Not only were they facing the loss of their home, but their marriage was clearly under severe strain. The financial pressure that I'd tried to protect them from by covering the mortgage had caught up with them anyway, but now it was compounded by damaged credit and potential foreclosure proceedings. "Chris, how much do you owe to bring the account current?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the approximate figure. "With the missed payments and all the late fees and penalties, it's about $6,000, he said, "and that's just to stop the foreclosure process. We'd still have to prove we can make the ongoing monthly payments, $6,000. It was a significant amount, but it wasn't insurmountable. What concerned me more was his mention of proving they could make ongoing payments. If they hadn't been able to handle the mortgage for the past 2 months, what had changed that would make it manageable going forward? "What's your plan?" I asked. "How are you thinking about resolving this?" "I don't know," Chris admitted, and the defeat in his voice was heartbreaking. "I've been looking into second jobs, maybe weekend work, but even with extra income, the monthly payment is just so much of our budget. I think Miranda might be right about just walking away from the house." The thought of Chris losing the home he'd been so excited about, the house I'd helped him buy, felt like watching a slow-motion disaster. But as much as my heart ached for Chris, I couldn't ignore the pattern that had brought us to this point. "Chris," I said carefully, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. When you and Miranda decided to take over the mortgage payments, did you actually run the numbers? Did you sit down and figure out if you could afford $2,400 a month on top of all your other expenses?" The silence that followed was answer enough. "We thought we could make it work," he finally said. "Miranda had been talking about asking for a raise at work, and I was hoping to get promoted this year. We figured between those potential increases and cutting back on some other spending, you were counting on money you didn't have yet," I said, not unkindly, but not sugarcoating it either. "Chris, you can't budget based on hypothetical income. That's exactly the kind of financial planning that gets people into serious trouble." "I know that now," he said miserably. "I know we handled everything wrong, but Mom, I'm desperate here. Is there any way, would you consider helping us one more time, just to catch up the missed payments and maybe cover us for a few more months until we can figure something else out?" There it was, the request I'd been expecting since Mrs. Patterson showed me that foreclosure notice. The familiar pattern that had defined our relationship for years. Chris makes poor decisions, faces consequences, then turns to me to fix the problem. "Chris," I said slowly. What's different this time? You couldn't afford the payment in March, you couldn't afford it in April, and now it's May. What's changed that would make it affordable going forward? I'm working on picking up some freelance consulting work, he said quickly, and Miranda's boss has been talking about expanding her role, which would come with a salary increase. More hypothetical income, more wishful thinking, instead of realistic planning. I felt a familiar frustration building, the same feeling I'd experienced during his college years, when he'd repeatedly gotten himself into situations that required my financial intervention to resolve. Chris, I need you to understand something, I said. For over 2 years, I covered your mortgage payments without ever mentioning it, or making you feel bad about needing help. That was nearly $30,000 of my retirement savings. When you decided to take over those payments, Miranda's exact words were that it was important for your marriage to handle all your own responsibilities. I remember, he said quietly. She made it very clear that my help was no longer welcome, that you needed to be financially independent. Those weren't my words, Chris, those were hers. And now, 3 months later, you're asking me to go back to the same arrangement that she rejected. Chris was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. What if we paid you back? What if we set up a payment plan to reimburse you for everything you've already spent, plus whatever help you might give us now? The offer might have meant something if it had come from someone with a track record of financial responsibility, but this was the same person who just admitted he couldn't afford his basic housing costs and was hoping to solve the problem with theoretical future income. Chris, you can't pay me back if you can't afford your mortgage payment. Where would the money for a payment plan come from? Another long silence. I could practically hear him realizing that his proposed solution made no logical sense. Look, I said, I'm not saying this to be cruel. I'm saying it because someone needs to help you see this situation clearly. You're asking me to solve a problem that will just happen again in 3 months, or 6 months, or whenever your budget gets tight again. But what am I supposed to do? He asked, and I could hear tears in his voice. Just lose the house, start over with ruined credit. Miranda's already talking about divorce lawyers. The mention of divorce made my chest tighten with worry, but I forced myself to stay focused on the larger issue. Chris, maybe losing the house isn't the worst thing that could happen. Maybe it's the wake-up call you need to start living within your actual means instead of the means you wish you had. Mom, please, he said. I know we messed up. I know we handled everything wrong, but I can't lose everything. I can't lose Miranda, and I can't lose the house we put so much work into. Isn't there some way you could help us just one more time? The desperation in his voice was heartbreaking, but I'd learned something important over the past few months about the difference between helping and enabling. Chris, I said, taking a deep breath, I need you to listen to me very carefully. What you're asking me to do isn't help, it's enabling. Every time I've stepped in to solve your financial problems, I've prevented you from learning how to solve them yourself. But this is different, he protested. This is our home. This is everything Miranda and I have built together. Is it? I asked. Or is it something you built with my money that you're now asking me to continue building with more of my money? The words came out harsher than I'd intended, but they needed to be said. Chris was quiet for so long, I thought he might have hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was small and defeated. What am I supposed to tell Miranda? She's already talking about how her sister was right, how we should never have gotten involved with family money in the first place. The mention of Cecilia's influence sparked something in me. You mean the same sister who's been living in your house rent-free for 7 months while giving you advice about financial independence? The same sister who encouraged Miranda to cut me out of your financial arrangements without having any realistic plan for how you'd manage on your own. That's not... Cecilia was just trying to help us establish better boundaries, Chris said, but he sounded less certain than before. Chris, let me ask you something. In all the months that Cecilia has been staying with you, has she contributed to the household expenses? Has she helped with utilities, groceries, mortgage payments, anything? Another uncomfortable silence. She's been between jobs, he finally said, and she was going through the divorce, so money was tight for her. So let me understand this correctly, I said. feeling my frustration crystallize into something sharper. Cecilia, who hasn't paid rent in 7 months, convinced you and Miranda that accepting help from your mother was unhealthy and created bad boundaries. And you listened to her advice about financial independence while she was living off your financial generosity. When Chris didn't respond, I continued. Did it ever occur to you that maybe Cecilia wanted you to stop accepting help from me because it meant there was less money available for you to spend supporting her? Mom, that's not fair, Chris said. But his voice lacked conviction. What's not fair is watching my son destroy his marriage and his financial future, because he's taking advice from someone who's been taking advantage of his generosity while criticizing mine. The conversation was getting heated in ways I hadn't intended, but months of hurt and frustration were finally finding their voice. I took a moment to calm myself before continuing. Chris, I want you to think about something. When I was helping with your mortgage, were you and Miranda happy? Were you building the life you wanted together? Yes, he said quietly. Things were good between us then. And now, how's your relationship now that you're handling everything independently? It's terrible, he admitted. We fight about money constantly. Miranda resents having to stress about the mortgage payment every month. She says the house doesn't feel like home anymore, because she's always worried about losing it. So Cecilia's advice about financial independence has actually made your marriage worse, not better. I guess I never thought about it that way. I felt a small opening, a chance to help Chris see the situation more clearly. What if the problem isn't accepting help from family? What if the problem is not having realistic conversations about what help you actually need and what you can realistically manage on your own? Chris was quiet, presumably thinking about what I'd said. Here's what I'm willing to do, I continued. I'm willing to sit down with you, without Miranda, without Cecilia, just you and me, and help you create a realistic budget. We'll figure out what you can actually afford for housing, what kind of payment plan might work for your income, and whether keeping this particular house makes financial sense. And then what? He asked. And then you make adult decisions based on real numbers instead of wishful thinking. Maybe that means downsizing to a less expensive house. Maybe it means finding ways to increase your income that don't depend on promotions that may never happen. Maybe it means having honest conversations with Miranda about what lifestyle you can actually afford. What about the current crisis? What about the foreclosure notice? I took a deep breath, knowing this was the crucial moment. Chris, I'm not going to enable this pattern anymore. If you want to save this house, you need to figure out how to do it with resources you actually have, not resources you're hoping I'll provide. The silence stretched between us, heavy with years of complicated family dynamics and financial entanglement. I understand, he finally said. But I could hear in his voice that he didn't really understand, not yet. He was still hoping I'd change my mind, still expecting that maternal instinct to override my logical boundaries. I recognized that tone from years of similar conversations, the resigned acceptance that wasn't really acceptance at all, but simply a strategic retreat while he figured out another approach. Chris, I said gently, I can hear that you're not really hearing what I'm saying. You're still thinking this is a temporary setback, that somehow things will work out, and I'll come around to helping you again. That's not, he started to protest, then stopped. After a moment he sighed. Maybe you're right. Maybe I am still hoping you'll change your mind. I need you to understand that this isn't about punishment, or me being angry with you, I explained. This is about recognizing that the help I've been providing hasn't actually helped you build financial stability, it's just postponed the day when you'd have to face these realities. So what happens now? Chris asked. Do I just let the house go into foreclosure? Do I tell Miranda that we're going to lose everything because my mother won't help us? The slight edge of resentment in his voice told me everything I needed to know about how he was framing this situation. Even now, facing the consequences of decisions he and Miranda had made, he was still looking for ways to make their crisis someone else's responsibility. Chris, you're not losing everything because I won't help you. You're in this situation because you took on financial obligations you couldn't afford, and then rejected the help that was keeping those obligations manageable. But we only rejected your help because Miranda felt pressured by Cecilia, and because we thought we could handle it, he said. his voice rising with frustration. We made a mistake, okay? We made a terrible mistake. But does that mean we deserve to lose everything? It's not about what you deserve, I replied. It's about what naturally happens when you make certain choices. Actions have consequences, Chris. That's not punishment. That's just how life works. I could hear him breathing heavily on the other end of the line, clearly struggling with emotions I couldn't quite identify. Anger, fear, disappointment, maybe all three mixed together. The thing is, Mom, he said finally, Miranda keeps saying that this whole situation proves her point about not accepting help from family. She says the only reason we're in this mess is because we became too dependent on you, and when you pulled that help away, we couldn't cope. The irony was staggering. Miranda was blaming their crisis on having accepted my help, when the reality was that my help had been the only thing preventing exactly this kind of crisis. But I could see how someone might twist the narrative that way, especially if they were looking for someone else to blame for their poor financial planning. What do you think, Chris? I asked. Do you think you're in this situation because I helped you too much, or because you and Miranda made financial decisions based on wishful thinking instead of realistic planning? He was quiet for a long time. When he finally answered, his voice was subdued. I think we got used to not having to worry about the mortgage payment, and when we suddenly had to take it on, we weren't prepared for how much it would change our monthly budget, but we told ourselves we could make it work because we wanted it to be true. It was the most honest assessment he'd given me of their situation, and I felt a small spark of hope that maybe he was starting to see things more clearly. That's exactly right, I said. And the scary part is, even if I helped you catch up on the missed payments right now, you'd be in the exact same situation again in a few months. The underlying problem that you can't afford the house wouldn't be solved. So what are you suggesting? That we should just give up on the house entirely? I'm suggesting that you should make decisions based on what you can actually afford, not on what you wish you could afford. Maybe that means downsizing. Maybe it means finding ways to increase your income significantly. Maybe it means both. Miranda will never agree to sell the house, Chris said. She's put so much work into decorating it, making it perfect. She says it's the only thing that makes her feel successful. Chris, a house that you can't afford isn't a symbol of success. It's a symbol of living beyond your means. And if it's causing constant stress in your marriage, it's not making either of you happy. The conversation was winding down, and I could sense Chris's growing realization that I wasn't going to provide the financial rescue he'd been hoping for. I need to go, he said, finally. I need to think about everything you've said. Of course, I said. And Chris, I want you to know that I love you, and I want what's best for you. Sometimes what's best isn't what feels good in the moment. After we hung up, I sat in my quiet condo feeling emotionally drained, but oddly relieved. For the first time in years, I'd managed to have a completely honest conversation with Chris about money and responsibility, without ultimately caving in and offering to fix his problems for him. The next few days passed without any contact from Chris, which didn't surprise me. He was probably processing our conversation and trying to figure out alternative solutions that didn't require admitting the house was beyond their means. What did surprise me was the call I received on Thursday morning from Miranda herself. I hadn't spoken to her directly since that awkward Christmas dinner conversation, and hearing her voice on my caller ID made my stomach tighten with apprehension. Elaine, she said, and her tone was different from any conversation we'd ever had, less polished, more raw. I need to talk to you about Chris. Okay, I said, cautiously, settling into my kitchen chair and bracing myself for whatever was coming. He told me about your conversation earlier this week, she continued, about how you're not going to help us with the mortgage situation, and I have to say, I'm really disappointed in your response. I felt my jaw clench at the accusatory tone, but I forced myself to stay calm. I'm sorry you're disappointed, Miranda. Can you help me understand what you think I should be doing differently? I think you should be supporting your son during one of the most difficult periods of his life, she said, her voice rising slightly. Instead of lecturing him about financial responsibility when he's already beating himself up over this situation. Miranda, I said carefully, Chris isn't in this situation because of bad luck or circumstances beyond his control. He's in this situation because you both made financial decisions without having realistic plans for how to sustain them. That's exactly the kind of judgmental attitude I'm talking about, she shot back. We asked you to stop paying the mortgage because Cecilia helped us understand that we needed to establish better boundaries with family money. We were trying to become more independent, and now you're punishing us for it. The revisionist history was breathtaking. According to Miranda's version, they'd made a mature decision about family boundaries, and I was now being vindictive by not rescuing them from the consequences of that decision. Miranda, let me ask you something, I said. When you decided to take over the mortgage payments, did you actually verify that you could afford $2,400 a month on top of all your other expenses? Of course we ran the numbers, she said defensively. And those numbers showed that you could comfortably afford the payment? There was a pause. We knew it would be tight, but we thought we could make it work by being more careful with our other spending. Being more careful with spending that apparently included supporting Cecilia for 7 months without her contributing to household expenses. Cecilia is family, Miranda said quickly. She was going through a divorce and needed our help. So it was okay to help Cecilia with her housing costs, but it was unhealthy for me to help you with yours? Another pause, longer this time. That's different. Cecilia is my sister, and it was temporary. Miranda, I helped you with mortgage payments for over 2 years. How is supporting your sister for 7 months more temporary than what I was doing for you? I could hear her breathing change, becoming more agitated. Look, Elaine, I don't want to get into an argument about family dynamics. The point is, Chris is in crisis right now. His marriage is falling apart, he's facing foreclosure, and instead of helping him, you're giving him lectures about financial planning. What I'm giving him is the opportunity to learn how to solve problems without depending on other people's money to fix them, I replied. That's not punishment, that's preparation for adult life. Adult life? Miranda's voice was sharp with anger now. He's 31 years old, Elaine. He doesn't need you to teach him lessons about adult life. He needs his mother to support him when he's struggling. Miranda, I supported Chris for over 2 years by covering a mortgage payment you couldn't afford. I supported him with the down payment that made buying the house possible in the first place. What I won't do is continue supporting financial decisions that are fundamentally unsustainable. Fine, she said coldly. I hope you're prepared to explain to your future grandchildren why their grandmother chose to let their parents lose their home, rather than help family. The threat hung in the air between us, designed to hit me where it would hurt most. Miranda, I said quietly, if you and Chris have children someday, I hope you'll teach them that love isn't measured by how much money someone is willing to give you, and that family relationships aren't based on financial transactions. That's easy for you to say when you're not the one losing everything, she replied bitterly. What are you losing exactly? A house you couldn't afford, that was causing constant stress in your marriage, that you were only able to buy because of my down payment, and only able to keep because of my monthly payments. The question seemed to catch her off guard. We're losing our home, she said, but with less conviction than before. Miranda, a home you can't afford isn't really yours. It's a financial liability that's been subsidized by other people. Maybe what you're actually losing is the illusion that you could maintain a lifestyle beyond your means. I can't believe how cold you're being about this, she said. Chris is your son. This house represents everything we've worked for, everything we've built together. What you built together was funded by my retirement savings, I pointed out. The house itself, the ability to afford it, the monthly payments that kept it out of foreclosure, all of that came from me. So what exactly did you and Chris build on your own? The silence that followed was heavy with uncomfortable truths. We put our love into that house, Miranda said finally, her voice smaller now. We made it beautiful, we planned our future there, and you can love each other and plan your future in a house you can actually afford, I replied gently. Miranda, the most loving thing I can do right now is stop enabling financial choices that are ultimately going to destroy your marriage and your credit. Chris said you offered to help him create a budget, she said, changing tactics slightly. That's right, I offered to help him understand what he can realistically afford, and what options might be available based on his actual income. And what if that budget shows he can't afford any house in a decent neighborhood? What if it shows we need to move to some tiny apartment in a bad area? Then you'll know the truth about your financial situation instead of living in a fantasy that's causing you constant stress and conflict. Miranda was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of genuine vulnerability I hadn't heard before. Elaine, I'm scared. I'm scared we're going to lose everything and have to start over with nothing. Miranda, you won't have nothing. You'll have each other. You'll have your jobs. You'll have the experience of learning what you can actually afford. That's not nothing. That's a foundation you can actually build on. But what about all the work we've put into the house, all the improvements, all the time and money we've invested? Sometimes the most expensive lesson you can learn is that you can't afford something you thought you could. But it's still a lesson worth learning. She hung up without saying goodbye, leaving me sitting in my kitchen wondering if anything I'd said had gotten through to her. The following week brought an unexpected development. Mrs. Patterson knocked on my door Tuesday morning, holding her usual cup of coffee and wearing the expression she reserved for sharing particularly juicy neighborhood news. Elaine dear, she said, when I invited her in, I thought you should know what I observed yesterday evening at Chris and Miranda's house. I poured myself coffee and settled in to hear whatever drama had unfolded next door to the drama I was trying to distance myself from. There was quite a scene around dinner time, Mrs. Patterson continued. A young woman, I assume it was Cecilia, based on your descriptions, came storming out of the house carrying 2 large suitcases. She was shouting something about ungrateful family members and impossible situations. This was interesting. Did you see Chris or Miranda? Oh yes. Miranda followed her out to the driveway, and they had quite an argument. I couldn't hear everything, but I definitely caught phrases like financial reality and tired of supporting everyone else's problems. It sounded like Miranda was telling Cecilia she needed to find her own place. So Miranda had finally reached her breaking point with her sister's extended stay. I wondered what had triggered that decision, whether it was the mounting financial pressure, or perhaps some realization about Cecilia's role in their current crisis. There's more, Mrs. Patterson said, settling back in her chair with the satisfaction of someone who had premium gossip to share. About an hour after Cecilia left, I saw Chris loading boxes into his car. He made several trips, and when I saw him this morning, he was coming from the direction of the apartment complex on Maple Street. Chris had moved out. The marriage that Miranda had been so determined to protect through financial independence had apparently crumbled anyway. How did Miranda seem when you saw her? Ask. Honestly, relieved, if anything. Not happy, certainly, but like some enormous weight had been lifted off her shoulders. I spent the rest of that day processing this information and wondering whether I should reach out to Chris. Part of me wanted to call and check on him, to make sure he was okay, and see if there was anything I could do to help him navigate this transition. But another part of me recognized that this was exactly the kind of situation where he needed to figure things out for himself. Wednesday morning brought the call I'd been half expecting. Chris's voice sounded hollow, exhausted, but somehow clearer than it had in months. Mom, I wanted to let you know that Miranda and I are separating. I moved out Monday night. I'm sorry to hear that, Chris. How are you doing? Better than I expected, actually. It's been so stressful trying to keep the house and the marriage together when neither one was really working. Now at least I can focus on figuring out what comes next without all the constant conflict. What are Miranda's plans for the house? She's going to let it go into foreclosure. She finally admitted that she can't afford the payments on her salary alone, and she doesn't want to deal with trying to arrange a short sale. How do you feel about that decision? I asked, genuinely curious about his emotional response to losing the house that had represented so much to both of them. Honestly, it's a relief, Chris said, and there was something lighter in his voice than I'd heard in months. I've been lying awake at night for weeks trying to figure out how to make the numbers work, and they just don't. The house was beautiful, but it was never really ours if we couldn't afford it. This was the most realistic assessment of their situation I'd heard from Chris since the crisis began, and it gave me hope that maybe he was finally starting to see things clearly. What are your plans now? I asked. I found a 1-bedroom apartment that I can actually afford on my salary alone. It's not fancy, but it's clean and safe, and the rent is less than half what the mortgage payment was. For the first time in months, I'm not stressed about making my housing payment. That sounds like a good foundation to build from, I said, meaning it. Mom, I owe you an apology, Chris continued. Actually, I owe you several apologies. I'm sorry for taking your help for granted. I'm sorry for letting Miranda and Cecilia convince me that your generosity was somehow unhealthy. And I'm really sorry for trying to guilt trip you into fixing our problems when we were the ones who created them. The apology felt genuine in ways that his previous expressions of regret had not. This wasn't Chris trying to manipulate me into changing my mind. This was someone who had finally understood the difference between help and enabling. Thank you for saying that, I replied. It means a lot to hear you acknowledge what actually happened. I've been doing a lot of thinking since Miranda and I separated, he said, about how I got so comfortable, depending on other people to solve my financial problems. First you, then Miranda's income to help cover expenses we couldn't really afford, then hoping Cecilia would contribute something to household costs even though she never offered. What conclusions have you reached? That I never learned how to live within my actual means because there was always someone else to fall back on when my budget didn't work. You taught me a lot of things growing up, but somehow I missed the lesson about only spending money I actually had. I felt a complex mix of pride and sadness hearing him articulate this understanding. Pride that he was finally grasping these crucial concepts, but sadness that it had taken losing his house and his marriage for the lesson to sink in. It's never too late to learn those skills, I said, and now you'll have the chance to practice them in a situation where the stakes are manageable. Mom, would you be willing to have dinner with me sometime? Not to ask for help or money, just to spend time together like we used to before everything got so complicated with the house and the marriage and all the financial drama. I would love that, Chris. We met the following Saturday evening at a small Italian restaurant that Chris had chosen specifically because it was affordable and unpretentious. When I arrived, I found him already seated at a corner table, looking more relaxed than I'd seen him in over a year. The constant tension that had characterized his demeanor during the mortgage crisis was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like relief. You look good, I said, as I sat down across from him. Different, Chris smiled, a genuine expression that reminded me of the young man he'd been before financial pressure and marital conflict had worn him down. I feel different. It's strange. I thought losing the house and separating from Miranda would feel like complete failure, but mostly it just feels like I can breathe again. We ordered simple meals and spent the first part of dinner talking about safe topics. His work, my book club, the spring weather. But eventually the conversation turned to more substantial matters. I need to tell you about something that happened last week, Chris said, setting down his fork and looking directly at me. Miranda called me to talk about dividing up our belongings from the house, and she said something that really surprised me. I waited for him to continue. She admitted that asking you to stop paying the mortgage was a mistake. She said she'd been so influenced by Cecilia's opinions about financial independence that she'd convinced herself your help was somehow damaging to our relationship. But now she realizes that your help was the only thing keeping us financially stable. How do you feel about that admission? I asked. Grateful, I guess. It means I wasn't crazy for thinking we'd made a terrible decision. But also sad, because if she'd realized that 6 months ago, maybe we could have worked things out differently. Chris, even if Miranda had realized it sooner, would that have solved the underlying problem? You still would have been living in a house you couldn't afford depending on someone else's income to maintain your lifestyle. He was quiet for a moment, considering this. You're right, we would have just postponed dealing with the real issue. And the real issue was that we were trying to live like people who made twice as much money as we actually did. What have you learned from this experience? I asked. That financial independence isn't about refusing help from family, it's about making choices you can sustain with your own resources, and that living beyond your means doesn't make you successful, it just makes you vulnerable. Those are hard lessons but important ones. Mom, I want you to know that I understand now why you didn't step in to save the house. At the time it felt like abandonment, but I can see now that rescuing us would have just taught us that we didn't have to face the consequences of our poor planning. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I admitted. Watching you struggle and not intervening went against every parental instinct I have. But it was the right thing to do. I hope so, I said. There were many nights when I questioned whether I was being too harsh, whether I should have found some middle ground that helped you without enabling the same patterns. Chris shook his head. There wasn't a middle ground, Mom. Any help you gave us would have just delayed the day when we had to face reality, and the longer we delayed it, the worse the eventual crash would have been. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both of us processing the weight of what he'd just said. Finally, Chris spoke again. I have something else I need to tell you. I've been meeting with a financial counselor through my employee assistance program at work. She's helping me create a realistic budget and understand how to build an emergency fund so I'm not constantly living paycheck to paycheck. That sounds like an excellent resource, I said, pleased to hear he was taking proactive steps to address the underlying issues that had contributed to his crisis. She asked me to calculate how much money you spent supporting Miranda and me over the years. The down payment, the mortgage payments, even smaller things, like the times you paid for car repairs or covered utility bills when we were short. Do you know what the total came to? I had a rough idea, but I deliberately avoided calculating the exact figure because I knew it would be substantial. Almost $60,000, Chris said quietly. In 3 years, you spent nearly $60,000 of your retirement savings, helping us maintain a lifestyle we couldn't afford on our own. The number hung in the air between us. It represented 2.5 years of mortgage payments, plus the original down payment, plus all the smaller financial assistance I'd provided when they faced unexpected expenses. Chris, I need you to understand something, I said. That money was given out of love, not as a loan or an investment I expected to see returned. I don't want you to feel guilty about the amount, but I do feel guilty, he said. Not because you expect repayment, but because I wasted such an enormous gift. If I'd used that support to build real financial stability instead of just maintaining appearances, both of our lives would be different now. What would you have done differently? I would have insisted on a smaller, more affordable house from the beginning. I would have built up savings instead of assuming your payments would continue indefinitely. Most importantly, I would have made financial decisions based on what Miranda and I could actually afford together, not what we could afford with your help. Those are all good insights, I said. And it's not too late to apply them going forward. I know, that's what the financial counselor keeps telling me. She says the most expensive mistakes are often the ones that teach you the most valuable lessons, as long as you actually learn from them instead of just repeating the same patterns. Smart woman. She also said something else that really stuck with me. She said that real financial security comes from living below your means, not from having enough income to live above them. That's exactly right, I said. Your father and I learned that lesson early in our marriage, which is why I was able to help you in the first place. We always lived on less than we earned and saved the difference. I wish I'd understood that principle sooner, Chris said. I spent so many years thinking that financial success meant being able to afford expensive things, when really it means having the security of knowing you can handle unexpected problems without depending on other people. What does financial success look like to you now? I asked, curious to hear how his perspective had evolved. Having enough money in savings that I don't panic when my car needs repairs. Being able to pay all my bills on time without stress. Maybe eventually saving enough for a down payment on a house I can actually afford on my own salary. He paused. It sounds boring compared to the granite countertops and wraparound porch, but it sounds peaceful. Peaceful is underrated, I agreed. Some of the happiest years of my life were when your father and I were living in that tiny first apartment, eating spaghetti 3 nights a week so we could save money for a house. We felt proud of what we were building together, even though it wasn't impressive to outside observers. Mom, can I ask you something personal? Chris said. How much did helping us affect your own financial security? I know $60,000 had to make a significant dent in your retirement savings. I considered how to answer honestly without making him feel worse than he already did. It required me to adjust some of my own plans, I said carefully. I postponed some travel I'd been hoping to do, and I'll probably need to work a few more years before retiring completely. But it didn't leave me in a precarious situation. Chris's face showed the impact of understanding how his financial crisis had affected my life in concrete ways. I'm so sorry, Mom. I never thought about how supporting us might change your own plans. Chris, that's what parents do. We adjust our plans when our children need help. But what became problematic was when the help turned into a permanent arrangement that you weren't treating as the significant sacrifice it was. You mean when we started taking it for granted? Exactly. When the mortgage payment I was covering became just part of your expected monthly budget instead of extraordinary assistance that required gratitude and careful stewardship. I understand now why you got frustrated with us. And I understand why you couldn't just keep subsidizing our poor financial planning indefinitely. We finished our dinner talking about lighter subjects, but the serious conversation had cleared the air between us in ways I hadn't experienced with Chris in over a year. As we prepared to leave, he reached across the table and took my hand. Mom, I know I can't undo the financial damage or the strain I put on our relationship, but I want you to know that I'm committed to never putting you in that position again. Whatever I can afford on my own is what I'll live with. No more depending on other people to make my budget work. That sounds like wisdom hard won, I replied. The following months brought a gradual restoration of the relationship Chris and I had enjoyed before financial complications overwhelmed our family dynamics. He called regularly just to chat without any underlying agenda about money or problems that needed solving. Our conversations felt natural again, free from the tension that had characterized every interaction during the mortgage crisis. In late summer, Chris invited me to see his new apartment. It was indeed small and basic, but it was clean, well organized, and obviously within his means. What struck me most was how comfortable he seemed in the space, no longer the stressed, overwhelmed person who'd been struggling to maintain an unsustainable lifestyle. The rent is $800 a month, he told me as he showed me around the modest one-bedroom unit. That leaves me plenty of room in my budget for savings, emergencies, and actually enjoying life without constantly worrying about money. It looks perfect for this stage of your life, I said, and I meant it. The apartment represented something far more valuable than granite countertops or wraparound porches. It represented financial peace of mind. I've been thinking about something, Chris said, as we sat in his small living room drinking coffee. I want to start paying you back for some of the money you spent helping us over the years. Not all of it. I know that would take decades. But something regular to show that I understand the sacrifice you made. The offer touched me deeply, but I had concerns about the motivation behind it. Chris, I appreciate that gesture, but I want to make sure you're not setting up another situation where you're stretching your budget to meet an obligation you can't comfortably afford. I've run the numbers with my financial counselor, he assured me. I can afford to send you $200 a month without affecting my ability to build savings or handle my regular expenses. It won't even make a dent in what I owe you, but it feels important to acknowledge the debt somehow. What does this represent for you emotionally? I asked. I want to understand what you're hoping to accomplish. Chris thought for a moment before answering. I guess it represents taking responsibility for my choices instead of just accepting your generosity as if it were free money. Even if I can never fully repay what you gave us, I want to demonstrate that I understand it had real value and real cost to you. In that case, yes, I said. I think that would be meaningful for both of us. 3 weeks later, I received the first payment from Chris, exactly $200 with a note attached that simply said, "Thank you for everything, and I'm sorry it took me so long to understand." The money itself wasn't significant in terms of my financial situation, but what it represented was invaluable. My son had finally learned the difference between accepting help and taking advantage, between family support and financial enabling. That autumn, I received an unexpected call from Miranda. Her voice was subdued, lacking the confident edge that had characterized all our previous conversations. "Elaine, I hope you don't mind me calling. I wanted to talk to you about something." Of course, Miranda, what's on your mind? I said, settling into my kitchen chair and wondering what had prompted this unexpected contact. I wanted to apologize, she said, and I could hear genuine emotion in her voice, for how I handled everything with the mortgage situation, for the things I said to you, and for not understanding what your help really meant until it was too late. I appreciate you reaching out, I replied carefully. What's brought this on? I've been going through financial counseling as part of my divorce proceedings, she explained. The counselor had me calculate all the financial support we received from family members over the years, and when I saw the total amount you'd contributed to our lives, Elaine, I was shocked and ashamed. Miranda, you don't need to feel ashamed about accepting help when it was freely given, but I do need to feel ashamed about how I treated that help, she said firmly. I turned your generosity into an entitlement. I let my sister convince me that your support was somehow damaging to our independence, when the truth is that your support was the only thing that made our lifestyle possible. I waited for her to continue, sensing there was more she needed to say. The foreclosure process has been educational, she continued with bitter humor. I've learned exactly how much that house actually cost to maintain, and I've realized that Chris and I were never financially equipped to handle it on our own. We were living a fantasy that your money made possible. What are your plans now? I asked. I'm moving back in with my parents for a while, to get back on my feet financially. My credit is ruined from the foreclosure, so it'll be years before I can qualify for a mortgage on my own. But honestly, after everything that's happened, the idea of a simple apartment that I can afford on my own salary sounds incredibly appealing. That sounds like a wise approach, I said. Sometimes stepping back allows you to move forward more securely. Elaine, I need to ask you something, and I understand if the answer is no, Miranda said, her voice becoming more tentative. Would you be willing to meet with me for coffee sometime? Not to ask for anything, just to, I don't know, maybe find some closure on this whole situation. I considered her request carefully. Part of me was curious to hear more about her perspective on what had happened, and another part appreciated her willingness to acknowledge the problems in how she'd handled our relationship. I think that would be okay, I said finally, as long as we're both clear that this is about understanding each other better, not about relitigating old grievances. Absolutely. I spent so many months being angry at you for not rescuing us from our financial problems, and now I understand that rescuing us would have been the worst thing you could have done. I'd like the chance to say that in person. We arranged to meet the following week at a small cafe downtown, both of us approaching the encounter with realistic expectations, rather than hopes for dramatic reconciliation. The cafe meeting with Miranda was surprisingly productive. She looked different from the polished, confident woman I remembered, more subdued, but also more genuine. We spent an hour talking honestly about the events that had led to their financial crisis and the end of their marriage. I keep thinking about that Easter dinner, Miranda said at one point, stirring her coffee absently. When I told you we wanted to keep it intimate, just immediate family, I was so focused on proving that we didn't need you that I forgot to consider whether we actually valued you. What do you mean by that? I asked. I mean that somewhere along the way, I started seeing you as someone who made our lives more complicated, rather than someone who made our lives better. Cecilia kept talking about how family financial help created unhealthy dynamics, and I bought into that narrative without ever stopping to appreciate what you were actually doing for us. And what do you think I was actually doing? Miranda was quiet for a moment, clearly choosing her words carefully. You were giving us the gift of financial security, so we could focus on building our careers and our marriage, without the constant stress of wondering whether we could afford our housing payment. Instead of being grateful for that gift, I resented the fact that we needed it. Why did you resent needing help? I asked, genuinely curious about her thought process. Because it made me feel like we weren't really successful adults. I wanted to believe we were thriving on our own merit, and your help made it impossible to maintain that illusion. So instead of adjusting our lifestyle to match our actual income, I convinced myself that the problem was the help itself. It was the most self-aware assessment I'd ever heard Miranda make, and it helped me understand her perspective in ways I hadn't before. The irony, she continued, is that rejecting your help didn't make us more successful. It just exposed how financially unstable we actually were. We spent 3 months proving that we couldn't afford the lifestyle we'd been living, and all we accomplished was ruining our credit and destroying our marriage. Do you think there's anything you and Chris could have done differently to avoid that outcome? I asked. We should have been honest about what we could actually afford from the beginning, she said, without hesitation. We should have bought a smaller house, built up our savings, and treated your help as temporary support while we got established, not as a permanent part of our budget. What would you do differently if you were making those decisions today? I'd choose the lifestyle I could sustain on my own income, not the lifestyle I wished I could afford. And if family members offered help, I'd accept it graciously while working toward not needing it, instead of either taking it for granted or rejecting it out of pride. As we prepared to leave, Miranda reached across the table and briefly touched my hand. Elaine, I know our relationship can never go back to what it was before, but I hope you know that I finally understand what you were trying to teach us, and I'm grateful for the lesson even though it came at such a high cost. I appreciate you saying that, Miranda, I replied. It means a lot to know that you understand the situation more clearly now, even if understanding came through such difficult circumstances. As I drove home from our meeting, I reflected on how much everyone's perspective had shifted over the past year. Chris was learning to live within his means and taking responsibility for his financial decisions. Miranda was facing the reality of her situation and making plans based on what she could actually afford, rather than what she wished she could afford. Even I had learned important lessons about the difference between helping and enabling, and about the importance of maintaining boundaries even when it felt harsh. The holidays that year were different from any I'd experienced since Chris had gotten married. Instead of the elaborate gatherings that had become strained with unspoken financial tensions, I hosted a simple Thanksgiving dinner for Chris and two of my neighbors. The conversation was easy and genuine, focused on gratitude rather than underlying resentments or unmet expectations. Chris seemed more relaxed than I'd seen him in years. He brought a homemade pie, something he'd never done when he was struggling with mortgage payments and marital stress, and spent the evening talking about his work projects and weekend hiking trips. He was building a life that fit his actual resources, and it showed in his demeanor. "Mom," he said, as we were cleaning up after dinner, "I have something to tell you. I've been dating someone new," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral while internally hoping he'd learned something from his experiences with Miranda. Her name is Sarah, and she's a teacher at the elementary school near my apartment. She's different from Miranda, more practical, I guess. She has her own small apartment that she pays for herself. She drives a used car that's completely paid off, and when we go out, we split the check. She sounds sensible, I said. That's exactly what attracted me to her, Chris admitted. After everything that happened with the house and the financial stress, I realized I wanted to be with someone who shared my values about living within your means and being financially responsible. Have you told her about what happened with Miranda and the foreclosure? I told her the whole story, he said. I was worried she might think less of me for making such poor financial decisions, but she said she appreciated my honesty and the fact that I'd learned from the experience. She said it showed growth and maturity. I like her already, I said, meaning it. I think you two would get along really well. Maybe after we've been dating a little longer, I could introduce you. But Mom, I want you to know that this time will be different. Whatever Sarah and I build together, it'll be based on what we can actually afford together. I'm never going to put myself in a position where I need family members to subsidize my lifestyle again. That sounds like the foundation for a much healthier relationship, I said, both with Sarah and with money in general. Christmas arrived quietly but contentedly. Chris brought Sarah to meet me over a casual dinner at my condo, and I immediately understood why he was drawn to her. She was warm but grounded, enthusiastic about their relationship, but realistic about their financial limitations. When Chris mentioned they were saving up for a weekend camping trip, Sarah laughed and said it would probably take them 3 months to afford it, but they didn't mind waiting. We've both learned the value of delayed gratification, she said, glancing at Chris with obvious affection. It makes the things we can afford feel more special. Watching them together, I could see the difference between this relationship and his marriage to Miranda. There was no underlying tension about money, no sense that either of them was trying to maintain a lifestyle beyond their means. They seemed genuinely happy with small pleasures, cooking dinner together, taking walks in the park, browsing used bookstores on Saturday afternoons. Sarah's helping me furnish my apartment slowly, Chris told me after dinner. We hit garage sales and thrift stores on weekends, looking for pieces that are functional and affordable. It's actually fun, trying to create something nice without spending much money. It sounds like you've both learned to find satisfaction in building something sustainable rather than impressive, I observed. Exactly, Sarah said. I think our generation got caught up in the idea that success meant having expensive things immediately, instead of working toward them gradually. But there's something really satisfying about knowing that everything in your home was chosen carefully and paid for with money you actually had. As winter turned to spring, I received regular updates about Chris's continued progress toward financial stability. He'd built up an emergency fund that covered 3 months of expenses. He was contributing to his retirement account for the first time in years. Most importantly, he seemed genuinely content with his modest lifestyle. I keep thinking about something my financial counselor said, he told me during one of our regular phone calls. She said that financial stress is usually the result of trying to live someone else's life instead of your own. When I was married to Miranda, we were trying to live like people who made twice our income. Now I'm living like someone who makes exactly what I make, and it's so much more peaceful. Do you miss any aspects of your old lifestyle? I asked. Sometimes I miss the house itself. It really was beautiful. But I don't miss the constant worry about whether we could afford it. I don't miss the fights with Miranda about money. I don't miss feeling like I was always one financial emergency away from disaster. And you don't miss the granite countertops? I teased gently. Chris laughed. You know what? Sarah's apartment has the original 1980s laminate countertops, and when we cook together in that tiny kitchen, it feels more like home than the showcase kitchen ever did. That's because you can actually afford the rent, I pointed out. That's exactly right. It turns out that peace of mind is worth more than granite. By the time summer arrived, I had settled into a routine that felt entirely my own for the first time in years. My mornings were spent tending to the small herb garden I'd planted on my condo balcony, something I'd always wanted to do but never found time for when I was constantly managing other people's financial crises. My evenings were filled with books, neighborhood walks, and phone calls with friends who valued my company rather than my bank account. The monthly payments from Chris continued arriving like clockwork, always accompanied by a brief note updating me on his progress. Emergency fund now covers 4 months of expenses, one note read. Sarah and I are talking about maybe getting a dog. We've budgeted for pet expenses. Read another. These updates brought me more satisfaction than any expensive gift could have. One evening in July, Chris called with news that surprised me. Mom, Miranda reached out to me last week. She wanted to apologize for how everything ended between us, and to thank me for not trying to fight the foreclosure or make the divorce proceedings more difficult. How do you feel about hearing from her? I asked. Grateful, actually. She's doing better now, living with her parents, working on rebuilding her credit, dating someone who's more financially compatible with her actual lifestyle. She said going through the foreclosure and divorce taught her the difference between wanting something and being able to afford it. That's a valuable lesson, even when it comes at a high cost. She also asked me to tell you something. She said she finally understands why you couldn't keep enabling our poor financial decisions, and that she respects you for having the courage to let us face the consequences of our choices. She called it tough love and said she wishes more parents had your strength. The message touched me deeply, representing a level of understanding I'd never expected to receive from Miranda. Sometimes the most difficult decisions we make for the people we love turn out to be the most valuable gifts we can give them. As autumn painted the trees around my condo complex, I found myself reflecting on the year that had transformed all our lives. The financial crisis that had seemed so devastating at the time had actually been a catalyst for healthier relationships and more authentic living. Chris was thriving in ways that his expensive house and stressful marriage had never allowed. Miranda was building a life based on her actual circumstances rather than her aspirations. And I had learned to distinguish between love and financial enablement. Mrs. Patterson stopped by one October afternoon with her usual neighborly coffee visit, but this time she brought unexpected news. You know, Elaine, I've been thinking about that whole situation with Chris and Miranda last year, and I wanted to tell you how much I admired how you handled it. What do you mean? I asked, though I was pleased by her support. I watched you refuse to rescue them when every maternal instinct must have been screaming at you to fix their problems. That took real strength and wisdom, and look how it turned out. Chris is happier than I've ever seen him, and he's learned to take care of himself properly. Her words validated what I'd come to believe about my decision. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is allow people to experience the natural consequences of their choices, even when watching them struggle feels unbearable. That evening, I called my sister Anne to share an update I'd been saving. I've decided to book that European river cruise we've been talking about for years. Chris's monthly payments have helped restore some of what I spent on their mortgage, and I realize I don't need to keep postponing my own dreams to be available for other people's financial emergencies. It's about time, Anne said with satisfaction. You've spent so many years putting everyone else's needs first, you deserve to enjoy the retirement you worked so hard to build. For the first time in decades, I was planning something purely for my own enjoyment, funded by money that was entirely mine to spend. The letter arrived on a crisp December morning, postmarked from Sarah's elementary school. Inside was a hand-drawn Christmas card from her third-grade class, with a note from Sarah explaining that she'd told her students about Chris's wonderful mom, who taught him important lessons about being responsible with money. The children had drawn pictures of families, houses, and dollar signs, with messages like, "Thank you for teaching Chris to be good with money," and "You sound like a nice grandma." One particularly touching drawing showed a woman with gray hair hugging a young man, with the caption, "Love is helping people learn." I smiled, remembering how terrified I'd been that maintaining boundaries would cost me my relationship with Chris. Instead, it had given us both the space to build something healthier and more authentic. That afternoon, Chris called with his own Christmas news. "Mom, Sarah and I are engaged. We're planning a simple wedding next fall, something we can actually afford without going into debt or asking family members to subsidize it." "Congratulations," I said, and meant it completely. "We were hoping you'd help us plan it," he continued. "Not financially, we've already budgeted for everything we want. We just want your advice and your presence." It was the most beautiful wedding invitation I'd ever received, a request for my wisdom and love, with no expectation of my money. Finally, after all these years, I was being valued for who I was rather than what I could provide. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone is the opportunity to stand on their own.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.